not. But what about women? None of these things, none of these little subjects were, of course, talking about the church, right? How does the church, how much power do they have? How much power does the king have over the church, etc.? So a lot of political debate in these times was about this and not about things that, I don't know, concern the people. Because the people writing about it, 99% of people couldn't read. So the people who could read were either the state or the church, so they were usually writing about each other. What happened in these times, in let's say Middle Ages, is that the church was getting more powerful for three reasons. One of them is that they internally got more structured. So you had a more clear hierarchy of bishops who gained power over all priests in their area, and then the Pope who got authority over the bishops, right? So it became this very clear pyramid, and that was unique because the rest of Europe was not a hierarchy. The rest of Europe was some very confusing mess of, in this city is ruled by that guy, and that city is ruled by someone else, but they both listen to this king, and that king then listens to the emperor. I'm going to explain more on this last time, but there was no real central authority, but the church was centralized. It was the same everywhere. So that made it stronger, right? It was the only real organized faction. It also became stronger because of the spread of monasteries. Monasteries are more or less autonomous communities, right? They grow their own food, etc. And they are, in practice, they're kind of outside of a country. Like they're on a mountain somewhere, nobody goes there. So the church had a lot of spaces that were only for them. And lastly, their big case became more important. People became more Christian over time and started more and more believing this idea that they needed salvation, that there was going to come a day of judgment, and that the church was necessary to save their souls. That idea became more widespread, and thus the church, who promises this salvation, became more powerful. Again, in the long run, they're going to lose this fight, but in the middle term, where we are now, they're winning. Another thing that happened is that the lines between the state and the church became less clear over time. From the side of the state, because the king or the emperor often would meddle with things, right? Kill a priest, kill a bishop, replace him, etc. So the state got meddling with the church, but on the other hand, the church also got involved in real politics. Often because the church became the state. How does that work? Well, the state are people who own land, right? In these times, like dukes and knights, etc. Now, sometimes these people who owned the land, who were living in the castle, they would give their land away to the church to save their soul. So you imagine a guy, the Duke of I don't know what, laying on his bed, dying, and then the bishop comes. How do I get into heaven? Have you been sinful, son? The bishop says. Quite a lot. Oh yeah, you're the guy who slept with his sister. Yeah, that's me. Okay, well, this sounds pretty bad. But what can I do, Bishop? Well, maybe you could give me all your lands, right? Just give all the lands to the church and I'll talk to God for you. And then the Duke was like, all right, rather that than eternally be in hell. So the church would often just get lands from people who were scared of hell. And that means that they're in charge now, right? That means that the bishop is now the boss of the city. So he became a politician because he was responsible now for the people in this city. And thus he became part of politics, right? He had to go talk to the king. Because now, if the king was going to do a war, needed troops, well, you're in charge of this city. So you have to give me some of your soldiers. So the bishops became politicians. And it all kind of mingled into this mess of overlapping authority. So that's the context of today's lecture. Now I'm going to talk about some debates that happened. There's some political writings. This is really taking from everywhere. These are just examples, right? Not the deepest stuff ever. So one example that I want to talk about last time, but we ran out of time, so I'm bringing it back here, are two theories that I think both are bad. Bad for the world, bad for us, by St. Ambrose and St. Gregory. Let's start with Mr. Ambrose, who apparently was a holy man. What Ambrose argued for and achieved was the more or less political independence of the church. So the idea that the church is, in a very literal sense, right? The church is a physical territory, is outside of national rule, is just outside of politics. So that the state has no authority over that. So he argued that churches, as in the physical thing of a church, the building and its and the cemetery and everything around it, was more or less outside the country. So he argued that churches were a bit like embassies are today. The Canadian embassy is not Mexico. It's Canada, right? Even if it's in Mexico City. So Mexican law is not valid in the Canadian embassy. He argued something similar like that for churches. That churches were just, and monasteries and abbeys and all their other buildings, were more or less outside of the rule of the land. And the people in them, the priests, also would be. Basically, that the church should be left alone. And you can understand it in a positive sense, that if you are a refugee and the king is trying to kill you, that you can go to church, etc. Doesn't mean that this happened or that this was respected at all times. But that's what the church was aiming for. And thus, if you're outside of the rule of the land, you're also outside of the law. And so the idea was that the church has its own legal system. And that, dear students, still has a lot of consequences today. Because you still see today, when something goes wrong in the church, let's say pedophilia, they have the instinct to try to solve it themselves, right? They have the instinct to try to keep the police and the courts away from this. They're like, oh, no. These are our people. We will take care of that, right? Oh, you bad priest raping 200 boys. We're going to send you to a monastery on a hill where there's no boys. That shall be your punishment. And this type of nonsense, right? You almost never see priests going actually to jail for the things they do, because they internally solve it. So they talk to witnesses and they bribe them with a Mexican kind of deal. And that whole idea that the church has its own justice system instead of normal police investigation, that comes from this time. That's not how the law works today. That's not constitutional, but they still do it. They still try to do it because they still think they're outside the law in some sense. I'm portraying it negatively, right? You can also think of it positively as it's a safe space or whatever. Then you have another argument by St. Gregory, who actually was the Pope at some point. So this is not a nobody. This is a very important guy. And he did something extremely damaging for political history. This is an argument that has a lot of consequences later down the line, in that he justified tyranny. So tyranny, as in you have a dictator who's cruel, and if you talk bad about him, he's going to kill you and things like that. He morally defended this against uprising against anarchy. And this is his argument. He says, look, leaders have their power because God wanted that to be. We talked about that last time, right? God chose them to be leader, and not they chose that baby to become the king, because God has some kind of plan with them. That means that if God destined them to be a leader, then God wants them to be a good leader, right? But that commitment, that responsibility to be a good leader, is a responsibility towards God, not towards you, stupid citizens, right? So the king has to be a good king because God appointed him, not because, I don't know, the people. So So that means that if a king is a bad king, if he's a tyrant, then he's failing God. He's not failing the people. So his punishment, and he will be punished, but his punishment is by God. And that happens after life, right? He's gonna go to hell, this bad leader. So in the meantime, you should not interfere. You should not resist this leader. You should not kill him. God's gonna take care of this. Now, the problem with this argument is, of course, that in like real life, what's actually happening is that you take away all the power from the people, because they have no argument to resist whatever. Even if the leader kills everyone, you cannot interfere because God is going to take care of this. But you know, you're all dead and they're dead, and this is going to happen in this imaginary afterworld. So that's not a very useful idea, right, for political equality. So both these ideas, the idea that the church is outside the rule of law, and the idea that you cannot even protest against bad rulers because the commitment is not with you but with God. This, of course, hurt democracy and equality and all of that, and politics in general, right? You can't really talk much about politics if you can't even complain about the king, right? So these things were going backwards, let's say. Now there are other debates actually, but they're all about internal church politics, which are not necessarily interesting. So I'm going to just pick out one, okay? I'm going to talk about the investiture controversy. Now, what was that about? Oh, wait a second. Do you have any questions about the last part before I carry on?
No, everything's clear.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the investiture. It's a beautiful, weird word. Investiture controversy, which was some kind of political debate that a lot of people wrote about. It's not relevant at all to us today, but back then they thought this was very important. And it's about the question of who can appoint bishops. So if a bishop dies, right, who decides who the next bishop is? It could either be the church, because it's a religious function, or it could be the king, because bishops usually later on in history have territory. They would have a city they rule. So it's a political function too. So the king would say, yeah, since he in practice is going to work for me, I'm get to appoint him. And this little fight became very big fight. So big that at some point there was a pope who, we're going to talk about him soon, who said, well, if you don't, I'm just going to dethrone the king. I'm going to declare in name of God that they're no longer the king, right? So this came to very high politics and even a bit of war at some point. Why am I talking about this? Not because I think you should care about who can appoint bishops or not, but because this is one of the first times where both sides are going to frontally attack each other. Therefore, they have to question each other's authority, right? They're going to say, you ain't about shit. No, you ain't about it. Nah. And that is useful because now the people who are just the audience, right? They start hearing arguments against the authority of both. They start hearing why the church, why they shouldn't listen to the church, and they start hearing why they shouldn't listen to the king. So this argument kind of weakens both, because it brings up arguments against both, and that long term is going to start inspiring people to resist them. So that's why this is somewhat relevant. So let us look at these arguments. I'm going too fast, I think. Okay. On the red corner, we have Pope Gregory VII of Rome. And in the blue corner, we have Henry IV of France, the French king. I didn't write down when this was. It's kind of a big thing I left out. I'm sorry for that. I tried to look it up last time. So these guys are gonna have a debate, not literally debate, but like write books about each other. Starting with the Pope. The Pope said, look, man, first of all, the church is a centralized bureaucratic organization. We have all kind of rules about how things work, and all the rules, I'm the boss. So since all power within the church, I can obviously appoint bishops because they work for me, right? So this is an internal thing. Plus, it's not just my authority. I'm also just more important than you, Henry. I'm more important because what we are doing over here in the church is our divine mission. We're trying to save humanity. You are just trying to make money or fight these stupid wars. I'm trying everyone. So I'm more important, right? And I need these bishops, and they need to be the right bishops so we can all be saved and get into heaven, which is more important than any argument you might have. And the Pope said, lastly, and if you don't listen, watch out, because I might just undo it, because well, this is a bit more complex. Let me retake that. To appoint a bishop or any other feudal position, so a duke, a baron, a knight, they need the king to bless them, right? You've seen this in movies with the sword, and they tap them on the shoulder with the sword, and they swear loyalty to the king. That ceremony, but they swear that loyalty on God. So I don't know if they're holding a Bible or whatever, or with the cross, or however they do it. But this is a holy oath. Like there's a priest present in that moment. So it's a bit like getting married for the church, right? That's how you become a high-ranking politician in those times. So since it's sworn on God, and since there's a priest there and there's a blessing, Pope says that since I'm God's representative, I can stop that, right? Because you have to swear on God, and I am like God's stand-in. So I can say, nah, that doesn't count. I can undo that. I can judge the ceremonies. Therefore, I can stop you from appointing a bishop. Because you can only appoint a bishop in the church name, and I'm the church, right? Quite a weird argument, but that's what the Pope was saying. Now, Henry was not impressed by the Pope. Henry, his argument was that you just don't have authority over this. There's a division between legal power, real life, earthly power, which says that I'm the king and have my army, etc., and your heavenly power. Like you have to concern about your things and not mine, right? I deal with politics, not you. And if I do it wrong, then, God will judge me, but not you. Second, you're just going out of your territory, because these bishops, yes, they're priests, but they're also territorial leaders. They levy taxes. They raise armies. They do political stuff. So you shouldn't intervene in that. You should not mess with what's happening here. Actually have authority. This is biggest argument, I would say. He says, yes, you're the head of the church, but you're not the boss of bishops. Remember, you got elected by bishops. You're turning it upside down. It are the bishops who elect the Pope, and that's true. That's how it works, right, in real life. Bishops come together and they elect the Pope. The Pope doesn't elect the bishops. You're flipping it upside down. They choose you, not you them. So you cannot then retroactively choose who your own voters are. That doesn't make sense, right? It's like if AMLO could say, only these states can vote, right? He would always win. You can't do that. Plus, you cannot dethrone me. I'm the king because of God, but most importantly, I'm the king because I'm the son of the last king, and you can't change that. That's just how it is. That's biology, right? So you can't dethrone me or stop me from appointing people, because that's my inherited right. It comes from God directly, not from you, Gregory. I hope you're not falling asleep. Um, but this is the type of stuff that we're talking about. So you can see they're both throwing mud at each other. And if you're listening to this, you hear a lot of good arguments against both of them. Why you shouldn't listen to neither, right? And that's long-term the effect of this. Also, the state will win this long run. Not this debate, but the bigger debate. Now, let's talk about more serious things.
Can you go back just a little bit?
Okay.
Because I didn't understand the last point where it says church cannot overturn inheritance rights. Can you explain it again?
Well, so this is a point about the appointment of leaders, right? Now, if you are the king, you're the king because your dad was the king. So the bishop cannot just say, oh, I refuse to appoint you. Like, I refuse to bless this. Because God already chose. Like, I was already born. I have this right by birth. You cannot say, oh, but God chose wrong, and I'm not going to make you the king. So to become king, like there's a ceremony and a priest needs to bless you, but the priest has to do it because there's no good reason not to. That's kind of his argument. Does it make sense somewhat?
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you.
They're not really geniuses at this time. But let's talk about something different. Let's talk about the comeback of some real philosophy, things that are actually about something. This started getting slowly better, right? Because a lot of these discussions are not particularly relevant. This started getting slowly better around the 12th and 13th century because philosophy was coming back. Before that, almost no one could read. But we started getting some educational institutions. We started having universities for the first time in Europe since the Greeks coming back. The church would do a lot of research in their monasteries where people, well, those were the people who could read, first of all, were the people in the monastery, the monks. Importantly, so they would be creating books and they sat around all day thinking about stuff. So now and then they would do research. Some of the earlier scientists were monks, for example, in biology. The whole idea of genes was discovered by monks. And this started happening. Also, somebody found Aristotle's notebooks in the rubble in some old library, I don't know, in Morocco or in Greece. And because Aristotle has been forgotten. And now they had Aristotle again, and via Aristotle they had Plato. And they started discovering all this Greek philosophy, and so the discussion became bigger again. They learned about democracy again, like, oh, crazy idea. Now, the thing I'm going to talk about is how did the church deal with this? How did the church deal with the idea that now you have all this other knowledge that's not based on the Bible that's suddenly injected into the debate? How do we integrate that? Because you have to absorb it. You have to say that that makes sense from a biblical point of view, right? Whatever these, like if it sounds true, then how do we reconcile this? Because the church was in charge of education. They were the only people who could read, kind of had the monopoly on truth, but they had to deal with these things. So they had to find a way of explaining this new knowledge. And we're going to talk about one philosopher in particular who dedicated his life to doing this. You might have heard of him. It's Thomas of Aquino, or Saint Thomas Aquinas, who lived not that long, from 1225 to 1274. Now, Thomas of Aquino was one of the most productive people ever, probably the most productive writer ever. And I mean this in a quantitative sense. Thomas of Aquino would write 15 pages per day. So I write an essay each month and some research, This dude wrote like a big essay every day by hand, right? So this man just basically sat in his office and wrote stuff all day. Was very inspired, right? I don't think anyone in history has been this productive and wrote that much text as him. And that's kind of why he's interesting. He's not interesting because he was right. Most things he says by scientific standard today are simply wrong. Because he has this very heavy where he takes all these miracles literally, and things that we wouldn't. Well, maybe some people would, but most people would not take religion that serious. But he did. He's more just interesting as he was the guys before him, like the guys I talked about earlier in this lecture. They're more busters. They're just guys who have political interest and they write a theory about it to justify it. Thomas was a real philosopher. So he's one of the first real comeback of philosophy. So I'm going to talk a bit about him. Now, his mission was to harmonize all these types of knowledge, all these books he had. He'd say we have to somehow make them tell the same story. A story that supports the church, of course, that supports Christ. So how can we absorb science into the church? Which is a very important thing, right? Because science could destroy the church. And his idea is that basically one explains the other. The idea is that the sciences are there to help us understand religious truth. I'm going to elaborate on this more. Susanna, you have a question?
Yes, I have. I'm sorry, it's because it started to cut the audio and I didn't understand why he was wrong on most of the things he said.
He was wrong because he takes a lot of biblical stuff very literal, things that scientifically just didn't happen. And he based everything on religion. So you have religion as in the things Christ say, right? Let's say that's true. But then if you try to base all other things on that, you start kind of it's like if you tell a lie and then to cover up that lie, you tell more lies, and to cover up those lies, you tell more lies. Like once something is not true and then you try to justify it with more inventions, you just get a lot of books about things that just never happened. If that makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Like if you say is angry, you're starting just on the wrong premise, and everything you're going to write after that is going to be wrong as well. And it's not because he's stupid, it's just because he started from wrong premises. And that's why most of what he wrote isn't true, even if he was very smart in how he said it. But his idea here is that sciences, and there were not that many sciences back then. So you had biology, you had mathematics, you had mechanics, I think you had geography and maybe some astronomy. There was nothing like physics back then. These sciences, they're useful insofar as they help us understand the general principles of the world. They help us understand philosophy. They help us answer philosophical questions such as, why are we here? Where does the world come from? How does it work, right? So science is useful insofar it helps us understand more philosophical questions. And those philosophical questions are useful insofar they help us understand the divine truth. So they are useful for theology, the revelation of the divine truth. They help us understand the creation, basically. Like, what did God want with the world? To understand that, we need to understand how the world works. To understand that, we need science. So he made it all make sense within the same framework here. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about this general worldview before we talk about how this all comes together. Because there's a principle in here. The principle is that things make sense to always a higher truth. I'm also going to get water because my voice is failing. So I'll be back in 30 seconds. So let's talk about this general principle, right? And keep in mind, I'm summarizing maybe like 40,000 pages of books that I never read in one slide. So it might be a bit inaccurate. But the general idea that he had about nature, right, is the idea that everything is subordinated to an end. So let's compare him to Aristotle for a second. Aristotle's idea, if you remember, of nature is that he says the main principle of nature is that things start simple and become complex. Remember that? He says that things have a certain potential and then that potential comes out. That's Aristotle. Aquinas says, no, the real principle of nature is that things make sense insofar they have a purpose. He says we only understand things if we understand the goal of the thing. He says everything happens for a reason. Everything has a purpose in nature. Every plant, animal, thing that happens has a unique function, right? That contributes to the whole ecosystem. This is a very biological way of thinking, right? Okay, spiders, for example. Spiders are horrible, but then spiders, they eat mosquitoes and then therefore they grow, and then the birds eat the spiders, and it has some purpose somewhere. And God thought of all of this, right? God designed, like everything exists for a reason in nature, and it exists insofar, or the reason that it exists is that it's useful to something more complex than itself. So the spider is useful because it protects us, who are more complex than a spider, from mosquitoes. So that's the idea, that you're useful, and you're useful because you're helping, and that includes by being the food of something higher up. Miss Astrid, what do you want to say?
Yes, just to understand, in comparison, Aristotle believes that the purpose of a thing is more, well, is clear as long as it continues to develop itself, while Saint Thomas believes that the meaning or the function is we need to know the function in order for a thing to be useful for humanity. That's what he says.
No, the difference is that with Aristotle, the potential is internal. It's inside the thing. While with Thomas, the meaning of a thing is external. It's how useful it is to something else. So the potential of a thing comes out when we see what function it has rather than its internal structure. So one has an internal understanding of development and of meaning, right? The purpose of something is that as it could be, or tries to become, as it's called, awesome as it could be. But what Thomas says, the purpose of the thing is that it supports something that is superior to it. So it is a function for something else. So in nature, the lower serves the higher, right? And the higher thing, it gives meaning to the lower. So let's say that I'm an idiot, which I might be. I'm an idiot, I'm a loser, but I am teaching you chingonas, and you are gonna grow up to be awesome people. So my purpose in this logic is that, it's your glory that kind of gives meaning to me as a teacher, right? And then you again, the awesome things you do makes sense in some higher sense. In the end, everything is serving God, right? In the end, things support more complex things, and they show more of God's ingenuity. And at the top of all of this are humans, because we're unique in the sense that we both have a body and a soul, and all the other things only have a body. So we then connect to God, and through what we do, we serve God. So the idea is that everything comes from God. God gives purpose to things below that, and that gives purpose to things below that, all the way down to bacteria. In other words, it's the Lion King. In the Lion King, I shared a link to this Cycle of Life video, right? Lion King is super conservative. Think about it. All these animals have to interrupt their day, from ants to hippos to giraffes to cheetahs. If they all have to interrupt their day, go somewhere else, travel, just lion baby. The lion baby, which will from that day onwards, will start eating them, right? The lions who do absolutely nothing for the other animals, they just kill them. And these other animals are somehow happy about that. They're like, yay, there are more lions. Let's all celebrate this, right? That is very weird. Politically speaking, Lion King is super weird. It's an absolute dictatorship of Mufasa. And the subjects, which he kills and does nothing for, love it. They're like, yeah, dictatorship. Let's go, lions. And you know, Scar is like the only person with political consciousness. Scar is like the only person who's like, what the fuck is going on here, right? Now I destroyed your childhood. But that's the idea, right? Things make sense because they're useful to higher things, and then those are chosen by God or something. If you apply that to society, you get a very conservative logic here, where if you apply it to people, okay, so you have animals, but then at some point it comes to us. So how do we do it? Well, we're dividing classes, and each class has their purpose. The workers have to work. Why? So that we, the priests, don't have to work, because we're higher than them, right? And then we serve the king, and the king is chosen by God. So you always have someone above you that, like, by supporting them, that's your role in life. And that also goes for man and woman, right? So the woman would then support the man, and that's like her purpose, and the man then supports the Lord, and that's his purpose. And so it's very warm in a way, because everybody has a place and everybody's useful, and like nobody's excluded from this. You all have your place, and you're all useful, and you're all, like, Thomas was very thankful for everyone. He didn't, like, unlike Aristotle and Plato, he didn't disrespect the working class. He understood they were all important, and everybody's important, but there's a hierarchy, right? This is a very conservative belief. I once was at a church. I needed to take church classes to be allowed to be married in the church or something like that. And this lady, this was in San Pedro, I live in San Pedro. This lady, she asked me, what do you do? And I'm a sociologist. I study poverty. She said, oh, so you think inequality is bad? And I was like, yeah, it's bad. Well, you know, what I think is that we all have a role in society. It's like the bees, like they down there, they do what they're best at, which is working. And we up here, we do what we are best at, which is, I don't know what, being in church or something. So she had this kind of beehive view of the world. Like you have worker bees and you have other bees and queen bees. That's this logic, right? They down there must stay there, and we up here must stay here, and you know, it all works together. And so now that's conservative, right? But he did this theory actually for more positive reasons, to keep kings responsible, because his idea is that the ruler, the one on top, right, he's only useful insofar he's contributing to this general good. If he himself or she is playing their function, right? And if they fail, if they are bad, if they lose their purpose, then everything below them lose their purpose, because everything below them is there to support this. So if the king is corrupt, then let's say the meaning of everyone's life below him also becomes meaningless. So the king has a lot of responsibility. So if the king is doing things that serve no purpose, like just trying to get rich for no reason, for example, now he's endangering the whole system. In that case, if they're not ruling by the law, if they're not doing something useful, then you can resist them. So here he's undoing this earlier argument that you cannot resist the king if the king doesn't follow the law. So the purpose of this argument is positive, but it's very conservative, right? Just like the Lion King is kind of propaganda for you to accept that there's a natural order, and that you should accept your leaders just because. Now, I want to talk a bit about the law here, because he says king needs to rule by law, and it's very important what he means by that. That's my last slide, don't worry. He has a very ingenious system of what law is. Very big system. He says there are 4 types of law in the universe. And each type of law, again, by this logic, exists to help us understand the higher type of law. So when he says the king needs to rule by law, he means something very specific here that is religious in nature. So this is a bit hard to understand, but bear with me, right? Thomas Aquinas says there are 4 types of laws that exist. He said the first type, the highest one, the supreme one, is eternal law. Eternal law is basically what God directly wants. So it's God's own laws, God's internal reason, God's plan, let's say, for the universe, right? What God is doing, like what he's actually doing, his master plan. That's the eternal law. That's going to happen because God set it in motion, right? How the stars work and the planets and all of that stuff. Now we cannot know this because we don't know what God is thinking, right? We don't know any of this, so we can't follow it, this law. Then the thing below it is natural law. Natural law is how God's plan is reflected in nature and in reason. So we don't know what God's plan is, but since God did certain things, we can kind of guess what he's trying to do, because he created the world and the world works in a certain way, and that's by design, right? So by how things work, we can more or less try to guess what the eternal plan is. For example, like I'm going to give a stupid example, right? This is not from Thomas of Aquinas, but since we cannot breathe underwater by design, we should not try to live underwater, right? God didn't intend us to live underwater, because otherwise he would have given us that capacity. He didn't. So it must be the plan that we don't try to live underwater, right? That's a stupid example, but since he blessed all people with reason, maybe all people are equal, since he made us social, give us social instincts, probably means we should live together and not kill each other, right? Since we're all trying to survive, maybe from that follows that we should have, police that protects us. So by certain things being present in the world, you could argue that there are certain natural laws, right? Certain things that were intended to be. That's natural law. Now, below natural law, you have divine law. Divine law is when God is actually talking to us, right? So some of eternal law is reflected in natural law, and some of natural law is explicit, and that's called divine law. This is when God, for example, gave the 10 Commandments. When Moses went up the mountain, and God just talked to him, said, do this, what you have to do. Most like, oh, you sure? I say, yes, write it down. So sometimes God is actually talking, as he does in the Bible. So these are the rules that we actually know for certain. Well, in his mind, right? So these are rules and the codes that are revealed to us through religion. So not all of natural law we know, but some of it is simply explicit. That's called divine law. These are things that we have to do because God said it. And below that, fourth layer, you have human law. So human law is us trying to interpret all of the above. It's us saying, okay, whatever little we know of eternal law or natural law, and what we know from the Bible of divine law, how can we use these ideas in our own legal code, right? So if, for example, we understand now from natural law and that life is precious, and we know from divine law that you shouldn't kill, then we should have laws that prohibit murder, right? So that's the human interpretation of these higher rules. Now, if that is true, then, and we live in very concrete circumstances. We have to adapt the rules a bit to whatever works for us, and that's human law. So you understand here the logic, right? Human law only makes sense insofar it follows divine law, which only makes sense insofar that explains natural law, and natural law only makes sense insofar that relates to God's plan. So everything makes sense from the perspective of the higher thing, just like I explained for society. So that's how law works. So law, in this sense, we don't make the law, we discover it. The law is already there, right? When we make the eternal law is there, and the natural and the divine law. When we're making laws, we're just declaring more accurately the rules. We're kind of specifying or explaining the rules rather than inventing them. And as the king needs to create his laws within this framework, and if he doesn't, he's a bad king, and we should get rid of him. I know this is a bit complex, but that's the idea. I went over my time. Dear students, if you have to go, you can go. If not, do you have questions for me?
Thank you, teacher. It was clear, actually.
All right. Since you have to go, tomorrow we will talk about feudalism. We'll talk about the politics and how it actually works. All right?
Doctor,
Good. Yes.
I kind of have a question really quick. So every law depends on each other, like it relates on each other. Like if eternal law doesn't exist, then the natural law cannot exist, right? Like they
Yes.
need to have each other for existing.
Yes, but no one was thinking that. Like nobody would doubt that God didn't have a plan. So that didn't come up. But if you look at it from today's perspective, if you say there's no God, then this whole system collapses, right? Because everything depends on the first one being true.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking. Like now many people don't, well, they have different beliefs or like God, I don't know, different beliefs. So this, well, this will collapse. So yeah, that was my question. Like they
This made
depend on each
sense
other.
in the world. Yeah, this made sense in the world where everybody's Catholic, which was the world back then, but that has changed. But still, in a philosophical level, it's interesting that you try to adapt your laws to your philosophy of what should be, right? All right, that's it, right? I'm gonna let you guys and girls go. So see you tomorrow.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, doctor.
Yep.
Bye,
See you.
teacher. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yes, bye.